Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're having a great day. I saw this new study out today, and it's a study that's been following tweets from people on Twitter and what their reaction is in their tweets. And it basically said that at the beginning of the pandemic, they studied 20 million tweets, and they found that 60% of the tweets contain fear in them. And I think they used 4 words in their tweets: coronavirus, COVID, NCOV, which is novel coronavirus, and a 4th word. And they found that 60% of them had fear in them. And then later, as the virus continued, that was at the beginning of March, but then as March went further into April, they found that a lot of those tweets were turning from fear to anger. So they started off with fear, and then they went to anger. And the study goes on to say how the government has to be more in tune with people and give them more updates so they shouldn't turn into anger, etc., etc. And how sometimes it's turning into hope and rays of hope, etc., and so on. You can see the study online. But it was a fascinating study to me, an idea that people's fear turns into anger. Because you see, from a Torah perspective, fear is one of the worst things you can have. I think it was FDR who said, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. I remember hearing the story. My mother always told it to me when I was a kid about Rabbi Baal Shemtov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement, and a great mystic and great righteous tzaddik. And he was orphaned by his mother and father by the time he was 5 years old. First his mother died right after he was born, and then his father passed away. And before his father died, his father told him like this: remember my Yisraelikol. His name was Yisrael, but they called him Yisraelikol. He says, remember Yisraelikol. There's nothing to fear but only God. Don't fear anything but only God, and then you'll be all right. And Rabbi Baal Shemtov says how this carried him through his youth, how he loved going out to the woods and spending time meditating away from people, and how sometimes he would sleep there alone, and he was never scared because his dad told him there's nothing to fear but God alone. Fear is a very bad thing. It's sometimes a natural reaction, but it's something that we have to try to stay away from. And as we see in this new study, fear sometimes could lead to anger, which is definitely not a good thing. The Torah tells us that someone who gets angry, it's like worshiping idols. Because if you get angry, it means you don't have faith. You're angry at your circumstances. You don't believe that God had a hand in it. So I want to tell you a thought in this week's Torah portion and connect it to this. The Midrash tells us something with that first seems very puzzling. The Midrash says like this. We all know the story. The spies came back from Israel, and they said, oh, this land is all, yes, it has nice olives and nice fruit, but there's mighty people, and we're scared of them, and we can't go in there. And the Jews wailed and cried all night. And what happened? God said, because you cried all night, you're not going into Israel. This generation will not go in. The next generation will go in. But the Midrash says something very fascinating. That the day that the spies went to Israel was the 29th of Sivan. The 40 days later, the day they came back was the 8th of Av. And the night they cried all night was the 9th of Av, which is called in Hebrew Tisha B'Av, which is the day we mourn the destruction of both temples. It's a day that many calamities have befallen the Jewish people on this day. And we all know we fast that day. The period starts on the 1st of Av, which is Tuesday night, tomorrow night, and goes through Tisha B'Av, which is next week. And those 9 days are a time of tremendous mourning. Says the Midrash like this: God said to the Jewish people, after they came back and they cried all night on the 9th of Av, God says, you cried in vain? You cried for nothing? I will make sure you have lots of reason to cry. And so has happened. Tisha B'Av has become the day of Jewish calamities, a national day of mourning, of grief, of pain, of suffering. But you think of it, it's not fear. What kind of thing is God telling the Jewish people? He's saying, because you cried in vain, I'm going to give you reason to cry. It's almost like telling a kid who cries because he didn't, oh, he said, oh, you cried for no reason? I'm going to punish you. I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to make you suffer so you'll have a reason to cry. What kind of spiteful thing is that? How could it be? How does it even make sense that God says to the Jewish people, because you cried in vain, I'm going to make you cry for good reason and make you suffer? That seems very unfair. But the answer, of course, is that God wasn't telling them that he was going to make them cry for a good reason. God was telling them, when he watched how they cried for no reason, he said, I see with the way you're acting that unfortunately you're going to have reason to cry. What do you mean? Think about the generation that went out of the desert. If there was ever a generation who saw miracles, who saw God's miraculous hand day to day, from the 10 plagues to God splitting the sea from them, to receiving the Torah, to the manna, to the well of Miriam, to the cloud of glory. I mean, a generation that literally lived miracles. They saw miracles in every day of their life. If there was ever a generation that should believe when God tells them they're going to go into Israel, it should be this generation. Yet, what happened? The rabbis say they succumbed to their inner fears. They got terrified. They didn't see their self-value and their strength, that God will watch them and everything will be okay. And the moment you succumb to your fear and you don't find your self-worth, then there's no hope left for you to be able to go further. Then the same thing will happen again. God says, you out of all people who had so much miracles succumb to your fear, then you should know that what's going to happen is you are going to go through this again, because you're not going to have the strength and the courage to do what you have to do. Fear is never a good thing. It's something we have to stay away from. Of course, we're worried about the virus and the pandemic, and of course we have to act responsibly. And of course we have to wear a mask wherever we go. We have to social distance and do what our medical people tell us and follow the law. But fear drives us to dangerous things, to anger, to hate. Fear is never a good thing. And that's what God was telling the Jewish people. You cried in vain for no reason when you should have believed. You'll cry for other reasons, unfortunately. You're going to cry for real reasons because you don't have that courage. And it's something else interesting. The 9-day period, which starts tomorrow night, is called the 9 days. Why is it called the 9 days? So some of the mystics and commentaries tell us like this. We all know we have the 10 Sefirot, which is the 10 faculties of Chachma, wisdom, knowledge, understanding, love, fear, compassion, gratitude, victory, etc., etc. The last one is called Malchus. What does Malchus mean? Malchus means inner dignity, royalty, the confidence, the strength, the knowledge to know that I will accomplish what I have to accomplish. Malchus is that which allows you to go out to the world and feel confident and feel strong and not to fear anything, to know that you can accomplish what you have to accomplish. Says the Torah, you know why it's called the 9 days? Because the moment you lose Malchut, royalty, kingship, which is the last of the sphere, the 10th one, the moment you lose your security and you succumb to fear and you don't have the confidence to know who you're going to be, then what happens is you come to destruction, you come to mourning. Then all the other of the 9 faculties, they don't exist without that inner strength, that malchus, which is the definition and culmination of all them, where you know your self-worth, where you don't have fear. And that's a good lesson to learn. Think about the study, how fear turns to anger, and we should teach our children and ourselves never to be fearful. We could be concerned, we could be worried, we could be precautionary, but fear is not a good thing. Remember what the Baal Shemtov's father told him as he was about to die. My kid, my child, hab nishmeide from garnished, nor for the Eibishter Aleid. Don't be fearful of anything at all, just of God. And when you have trust in God and you fear God, then you don't do anything wrong because you're worried that God won't be happy with that, but you don't fear anyone else and you do what you're supposed to do. Have a great day.